Foreign Affairs and Aid Subcommittee of the Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade for the inquiry into the role of Australia's international development program in preventing conflict. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which each of us is calling in from today. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present and also acknowledge the cultures of any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples present with us here today. This hearing will be broadcast on the Parliament's website, and proof and official transcripts of the proceedings will be published on the committee's webpage. I now welcome representatives from the Australian Council for International Development and member organisations who contributed to the ACFID submission to give evidence today. For the Hansard record, could you please state your name and the capacity that you're joining us here today?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm Matthew Morey. I'm the CEO for the Australian Council for International Development.
I'm Imogen Harper, the Policy and Partnerships Lead for the Australian Council for International Development.
Hello, I'm Kieran O'Toole, and I'm the Southeast Asia and the Pacific Department Director for an organisation called Conciliation Resources Australia.
Thank you. And then online.
And good morning. I'm Michelle Higelin. I'm the Executive Director of ActionAid Australia.
Thank you all and welcome to Parliament. This hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of the Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I would now invite you to give a brief opening statement before we proceed to discussion with members.
Thank you very much, Senator, or Mr. Watts.
Tim's fine.
Tim, thank you.
Pretty informal.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to provide evidence on the role of Australia's international development program in preventing conflict. ACFID's submission argues that conflict prevention is not peripheral to Australia's foreign policy, but rather it's central to regional stability, fiscal responsibility, national interest, and security. In an increasingly fragile Indo-Pacific region, prevention must be treated as a strategic priority. The evidence is clear. Prevention is cost-effective. I know this message has been emphasized in other submissions to this inquiry, including what DFAT has submitted. As one of our affiliate members, the Institute for Economics and Peace has found through their research, for every additional dollar invested in peace building in fragile and conflict-affected contexts, up to $16 in future conflict costs can be avoided. Responding after violence escalates is exponentially more expensive, financially, politically, and in human terms. Across 31 high-risk countries, there are potential savings of nearly $3 trillion over the next decade in avoided violence, displacement, and economic loss if prevention efforts are bolstered. And again, that's from the IEP's report. Civil society organizations, both Australian NGOs and their local partners, play a central role in preventing conflict. I was pleased to have a few of the committee members with us on Monday night when we launched this report, Australian NGOs as Strategic Delivery Partners. And that report does mention some of the things relevant to the findings and to the work of the committee. So thank you for those of you who are with us. Civil society organizations are deeply embedded in the communities that they work with and able to identify emerging risks, mediate disputes, strengthen accountability, governance, and also address inequality before it escalates into violence. Much of the programming that Australian NGOs already deliver in the Indo-Pacific region and beyond address drivers such as economic pressure, environmental stress, weak governance, social exclusion, and harmful gender norms. And we provided examples of this in our submission in both the pre- and post-conflict settings. Our central argument in answering the questions of this inquiry is that in a time of increasing conflict and displacement around the world, Australian NGOs and their civil society partners, including local faith communities, are essential for building resilience and addressing early conflict risks. Ensuring that Australian NGOs are a partner of choice in the delivery of Australia's development program comes with the added benefit of building strong people-to-people linkages back through Australians, building regional trust while also benefiting Australia's diplomatic standing. We are here today, I'm pleased to note, and they've introduced themselves with two of our ACFID members, Kieran O'Toole from Conciliation Resources and Michelle Hischelin from ActionAid, both of whom are going to be able to speak in more detail to some of the questions that I'm sure will come up from the committee. I've noted some of the questions the committee's asked in the hearings that have taken place so far around the humanitarian exemption, and I'm pleased to speak on that issue as well, because we do think that the lack of a humanitarian exemption is continuing to tie Australia's hands in terms of the impact it could be reaching in some of the conflict-affected regions around the world. I'm now going to pass to my colleague, Imogen Harper, who's going to provide the final opening statement.
Thank you, Matthew, and good morning all. Based on extensive consultation among ACFID members experienced in conflict prevention, peace building and policy, our submission makes 5 key recommendations. First, Australia should clearly articulate a whole-of-government conflict prevention approach that integrates development, diplomacy and defence with defined leadership and accountability. This also had the sub-recommendation of building the capacity of data systems and data collection across departments to generate robust real-time insights on drivers of conflict. Second, we recommended that DFAT should establish a clear central location for conflict prevention coordination and oversight, ensuring prevention is reflected as a specific policy goal. We think this is important to monitor intrastate conflicts more closely, which often start as localised disputes where CSOs are often present, before escalating to national levels and beyond. Third, development investment must complement investments in defence and diplomacy. Civilian-led financing builds trust, governance and resilience, functions that military assets cannot and should not deliver. As the Asia-Pacific Development, Diplomacy and Defence Dialogue, AP4D, have emphasised, stalling overseas development assistance relative to defence investments is likely to weaken conflict prevention in fragile contexts. Furthermore, findings from the review of the UK government's peace-building work in 2022 also highlighted the negative impact on peace-building outcomes that resulted from a reduction in aid spending that was shifted towards diplomacy. All this to say, development funding is key to ensuring sustainable conflict prevention and complementary to diplomacy and defence efforts. Our 4th recommendation outlines that Australia should reorient its development cooperation towards sustained investment to and through civil society, including flexible multi-year funding that enables long-term partnerships and rapid adaptation in fragile settings. Our submission puts forward ideas for these investments through programs and mechanisms, and many of these programs already exist and are ready to be scaled. It is important to emphasise in the current global funding climate that reductions to aid and development spending are likely to result in increased conflict. A recent paper from January this year, titled Aid Interrupted, Conflict Dynamics Following the USAID Suspension in Africa, by 3 Australian academics affiliated with Sydney Uni, Tan et al. They analysed ACLED data and they found an evidence of a 5% increase in the number of conflict events for countries in Africa with higher exposure to USAID cuts. Finally, our 5th recommendation is that Australia should strengthen women, peace and security leadership by directly resourcing women-led organisations and embedding them in prevention and peace processes. Evidence shows peace agreements are significantly more durable when women participate meaningfully, and this is something Michelle can speak more on. Thank you, and be happy to answer your questions.
Well, thank you. I think I'll exercise my prerogative as a chair to lead off discussions and start with a big picture question. Your submission, and indeed many of the submissions to this inquiry, focuses and leads in on the importance of an articulated whole-of-government approach to conflict prevention. Can I drill down into the practicalities of that a little bit and ask what your concerns are about the current effectiveness and the clarity of roles, integration and coordination and strategy for conflict prevention activities across the Australian government? And in doing so, can I ask if you can give examples of how the current architecture affects the design or delivery of development programs that you're involved in?
Yeah, definitely.
I'm happy to take this one.
Yeah.
So we think it's important the Australian government articulates its approach to conflict prevention for several reasons, whether this is through a framework or a strategy or another form of policy guidance. This framework should outline how defence, diplomacy and development efforts come together and can be better integrated for conflict prevention outcomes with clearly outlined roles, ways of coordinating, data collection and investments. There needs to be policy coherence in this regard. It's worth noting Australia has one of the largest defence to development ratios in the world, with defence spending 12 times higher than development spending, far above the OECD, many of the OECD countries. We don't want to prescribe how the government does this. However, the sector is ready and keen to engage further, and it should be grounded in existing commitments. One thing that comes to our recommendation 1 in terms of a whole and government approach, but we can sort of link this now maybe to recommendation 2, which was related to the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade's internal arrangements, in terms of establishing a clear central location for conflict prevention. So in our view, and the view of the organisations who've made submissions, it's the current approach to conflict prevention with DFAT is ad hoc and not clearly structured. We recognise that pockets of expertise exist, but are concerned without coordination we're missing opportunities for the development programme to approach conflict prevention. And this was also in line with the OECD DAC's recent peer review of Australia that said DFAT should better structure the department's conflict prevention knowledge and analysis to maximise the contributions of development investments to building stability and security. So we think a central location would help to make sure there's better oversight of investments that contribute to conflict prevention efforts across a broad range of programs, whether peace building, development and conflict prevention, of which the government funds. I might pass it over to Kieran, actually, if you wanted to expand on this.
Yeah, I suppose when we look at first of all, at one level, there's quite strong policy commitments, like through speeches from the Foreign Secretary, for the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Also, you see it in like the humanitarian strategy and elsewhere, a commitment to peace building and conflict prevention. I think where we see the gap is then how it's implemented. So in looking at how aid is delivered and how DFAT looks at conflict prevention is primarily through a resilience lens. So it's building peace through development humanitarian approaches. And that's also reflected in the peer review by the OECD, where they state that there's really a risk of the Australian aid programme looking at conflict prevention solely through a humanitarian lens. From a sort of like a peace building or conflict prevention specialists, resilience, through humanitarian delivery or development approaches, it's around, sometimes we call it the peace dividend. So it's around building sort of more cohesive societies through gradually providing sort of equal economic opportunities. I think that's, if you look at the toolbox of conflict prevention, that's just one part of that toolbox. There are many other different dimensions and tools within that toolbox for building, for conflict prevention. So, you've areas like security sector reform, peace processes such as negotiating peace agreements, mediation skills, supporting mediation processes, disarmament and rehabilitation of combatants, building peace architecture at a community level, in particular through civil society. They're the areas that I think DFAT makes less use of, and to be honest, in most places does not touch on or support. And I think that's in a sense, it's looked at through just implementing programs, implementing development and humanitarian programs. I think coming down to sort of why and some of the problems in trying to implement conflict prevention programs within DFAT, I think there's the lack of that central mechanism to be able to translate that policy ambition and statements of intent down into practice or into programs. So a central way of bringing it down. There's also a lack of an ability, I feel, to track progress in conflict prevention within DFAT, to be able to hold programs to account on conflict prevention. And then I think there's a whole area as well around do no harm. So development programs, humanitarian, and it's a slightly aside issue. Development humanitarian programs inherently can cause conflict. They can, without getting too much detail, they can, conflict-affected areas are quite complex when it comes to dispersal of power and leadership, and it can end up supporting one group versus another, in a very simplistic way. We don't see that sort of conflict sensitivity do no harm processes, analysis, methodologies that do exist being applied to DFAT's programs in a very systematic way. And again, there's no central place for expertise related to this. The other comment to make is, and difficulty in, and I think you alluded to it, Imogen, is around the needs of conflict prevention. It doesn't require large sums of money necessarily. They tend to be targeted. There's a need for flexibility, adaptation. They're adaptive type programs. While DFAT's aid implementation primarily goes through large pockets of funding through contracting agencies. So the mechanisms themselves are not necessarily set up for these types of agile type programs that are required for conflict prevention. I'll stop there. I think it's leading.
It's always hard when we have one member not in the room. Can I invite Michelle if she has something she wanted to add as well?
Yes. Oh, sorry. I'm here. Pressing the wrong button.
That's all right.
Yeah, look, I think on this whole of government approach, I think, and I will say this as ActionAid Australia, it's not necessarily ACFID's formal position, but I think what we see is this huge policy incoherence, particularly with Australia's objective, which actually was created under a coalition government to become a leading arms exporter, and then how that reconciles with our commitments under our foreign policy and our development program towards greater peace and stability, in the region. And we, I guess we're seeing this play out right now. And so I guess what we feel, this is at the centre of this discussion about, is Australia wanting to be a peaceful actor on the global stage and invest more extensively in peace building, conflict resolution, and development, with a particular focus on building resilience of affected communities, or is it wanting to be an actor out there that is contributing to the growing instability that we're seeing worldwide? So I think we do encourage you to think about that in this discussion. And I would also say, in this sort of global context, also where the opportunity is for Australia to provide leadership. We are seeing, 90% of countries around the world increasing its investment in military spending. Imogen highlighted the huge gap we can have in our own spending budget between defence and aid. And we also see, obviously, the US government as one of our allies, not only shifting from a focus on a focus to greater conflict versus and also a sort of a greater shift away from basic things like even gender equality. So there's a tremendous opportunity to step up at this moment and think about its role it can play. And this is obviously where there's a great opportunity to elevate things like the women, peace and security agenda. I'll stop there. I'm happy to say more on the WPS agenda if there's interest from the committee.
Just before I hand to my Deputy Chair, you may have been following I know you're following the evidence of previous hearings, and I'll come back to the humanitarian exemption after my colleagues have had a chance to ask. But at the last hearing, DFAT talked about their response to the internal evaluation of their conflict prevention arrangements that was paused due to COVID, and talked about the establishment of the conflict prevention and strategy branch internally. Can I ask what effects you've seen from that internal reorganisation of DFAT, and implicit in that is, do you see where is that not adequate from your perspective?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Actually, we were talking about this just on the way in. Kieran, do you want to comment on that?
This would be the restructure just at the beginning of COVID, where there was a conflict and fragility team.
There was the internal review.
Yeah.
That was paused due to COVID, and then there's been restructuring activity in response to that.
I think what we see at I suppose, a country level, and specifically where we work in direct relationship to DFAT is the Philippines, PNG, Fiji. We're seeing less of what I would call backup expertise, day-to-day infeeds into the missions, which leads to, in a certain sense, a gap in knowledge between, I suppose, the work that we do around peace processes, peace agreement negotiations, and the missions themselves. You're very much reliant on diplomats that have a sort of historic knowledge, have worked in conflict-affected areas, have had training in the past, and in a lot of ways, it's luck. You know, you end up, you've got the right person.
We do have deep expertise within those posts, but you're saying that the structure is there's not a central supporting structure of a sort of excellence, expertise being shared out.
Yeah. By the very nature, you have quite a lot of, you have turnover every 2 to 3 years. You have diplomats that learn, you know, you have amazing diplomats, I have to say, you know, that gradually gain that knowledge and expertise and understanding of the intricacies and the complexities of the conflict environments within which they're a diplomat, and managing aid programs. But it can take 18 months to 2 years, and then there's a turnover, and then it starts again. So that institutional knowledge and learning from mistakes, learning from successes is not happening like it was before. And also, I suppose the flexible, so that unit was able to do quite flexible, as I was saying, small projects, whether it's research projects to understand the nuances of the conflict system, for example, in the Highlands. There's, again, that lack of sort of small pots of funding to be able to do nimble, really impactful things. And I could give examples of the type of work we do, but it's small cost, high impact type of work is what we're constantly trying to do. And there's not really that access to that type of funding within DFAT. There is with other nations, obviously, other donors.
Okay. I'll make one higher level comment. Maybe as the rollout of the International Development Policy, which is coming up on about 2 years old, one of the areas of shift has been this focus on development partnership plans, and certainly, as Karen alluded to, that shift towards post having more autonomy or more direct control and decision making, which at one level makes a lot of sense. Though I would say, in terms of getting more contextual, more informed local level decision making, one of the things that came out of the OECD DAC review, which we have mentioned a few times and came out in January, has pointed out that for a department that has struggled with capacity and turnover, the reality is that decision making at post is often made by people who don't have the depth of expertise. So you've kind of moved decision making and authority out without the central backstop and some of the technical expertise that can help inform good decisions. The outworking of that was mentioned in the OECD DAC report is that you have people who, because their lack of expertise in the area, are very risk averse. And I would say this is one of our kind of ongoing concerns with a culture within DFAT of risk aversion as opposed to development impact and effectiveness. And it drives your decision making in terms of modalities that you use. But it's an understandable outworking when people don't have the depth of expertise to understand the nuance that they will then go to more rigid risk management approaches or try to avoid making the wrong decision. And as we've mentioned in our submission and has already come up and has been mentioned in other submissions, that need to have flexible, agile responses, especially in contexts where you're trying to do peace building and conflict resolution work, is essential. And so that decentralization, that move to post, when you don't have the capacity backstop or that central area of expertise that we've been talking about, that creates a gap.
Okay.
Yeah.
Deputy Chair.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just interested, so as compared to some of the defence and traditional military investment, would you accept that the sort of investment that you're seeking is more of a longer term plan? And I'm just to I guess, challenge that narrative, can you think of any examples where the return from investment in civil society organisations has been seen in a way that's sort of fast or sooner rather than later? Because obviously we're in a period where countries are starting to decide how do we respond to threats that are quite imminent, and so I'm just interested in your views on that.
Yeah, that's great. Imogen.
Great, I'm happy to start on that question. I think, we had a recommendation around sort of also military capabilities complementing development investment. So we really tried to draw out in our submission the complementarity, and there has been very good examples of this in Bougainville and Timor-Leste in the past. And so we did do one case study there. So I think, you know, NGOs and civil society play an important role across kind of all phases of disaster and crisis and conflict response. You know, typically there is integration, but it needs adequate resourcing, and the operating model would be, you know, DFAT would lead the strategy, diplomacy and conflict-sensitive assistance, the NGOs and UN agencies would deliver the programs, and then the ADF maybe would come in and provide logistical and other support as a time-bound enabler. So they're quite critical of working together. So I think what we really tried to pull out in our submission is that there are risks, as we've seen in other countries, of sort of defunding development and increasing disproportionately defence. And as I said before, defence is already 12 times higher than development in Australia. I think it's also important to pull out, you know, defence officials in previous Senate estimates and Parliamentary Committee evidence have, you know, in public hearings have said that, you know, NGOs deliver information that defence and DFAT depend on for risk assessment.
That's a good point.
NGO reporting can identify escalation indicators earlier than official channels. So this is very much what we're asking for in terms of early warning systems. NGOs are often there on the ground in the communities. They can identify those conflict drivers early and report that information back. And, you know, NGO partnerships strengthen Australia's role in supporting regional stability, particularly in the Pacific, another one from a defence official as well. So I think I might stop there and maybe pass it on to Kieran. Yeah.
I suppose I can give, because you were asking about practical examples, maybe I'll jump back a little bit, 2 practical examples of maybe the type of work that we do. So when you're talking about small projects, small cost, high impact, recently we brought the state solicitors team that are engaged in the negotiations between the government of Papua New Guinea and the autonomous Bougainville government out of PNG to meet with constitutional lawyers, to meet with lawyers that were engaged, sort of learnings from other peace processes, because they were sort of a stumbling block in those, stumbling block's the wrong word, but they were risk averse in the negotiations between the 2 governments. So for something like 25,000 Australian dollars, you do you're transforming their thinking around their role in those negotiations. So potentially pivotal to, and this was done in consultation with the Prime Minister's office, the UN. So identifying stumbling blocks in peace processes. So that's really targeted, low cost, high impact. That is not something that we would tend to get funding from DFAT, but you can see the particular interest in Australia in those negotiations. When it comes to an example, and maybe Michelle can give other examples as well, examples again in Bougainville, back, let's say 2015, 2016, the sort of authority in Bougainville was very much vested in what you might call warlords. So there were leftovers, combatant leaders, left over from the war, controlled most of the areas of Bougainville. From that period through to really over a 5-year period, I would say, in particular the work of civil society, engaging with, challenging these warlords, plus other work. So, for example, we would do an exchange with ex-IRA, right, from Northern Ireland, to talk about how you transition out of being a warlord into a civilian or a politician. But really pivotal to it was civil society's engagement at a community level and working with their communities to persuade these warlords to join the peace process. And it's done it's really I suppose the position that CSOs have. They work within that community, they work within those networks, within those environments. So it's a coalition of work, if you like, but civil society and the work of civil society, again, not very expensive, kind of pivotal role in changing the conflict dynamic in a place like Bougainville.
And Michelle, did you want to add anything as an example?
Yeah, I think on this issue of return on investment, and I think particularly with a focus on early warning, I mean, as you're aware, we have a clear recommendation around investing in civil society-led programs that enhance community early warning systems. and that this is critical in mitigating the outbreak and escalation of conflicts. And just to give you an example, I mean, already through the Australian Aid Program, Australia has invested in particularly women-led early warning systems that are now operational across 4 countries. And we have data from the one in Vanuatu that every dollar invested has resulted in $4 of savings in humanitarian losses. It has also contributed substantially to other development outcomes such as gender equality, greater inclusion, greater safety across the community. And we see that there's a great opportunity to think about how these kind of programs can be scaled and adapted to actually play a key role in conflict prevention. And I'd also say, I mean, there are incredible returns on investment through investment in Australian NGOs. We see this through the Australian NGO Cooperation Program, where not only do we have support from nearly 1 million Australians, we also have financial support that enables that program to reach further and have greater impact. I mean, Matthew would have the exact figures in terms of the additional contribution that comes from that. But there's some of the ways that we are trying to promote a greater return on investment for our aid dollar.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Newman.
Just finished reading Anthony Beevor's book on the Russian Civil War in 1917 to 1921, and what really struck me was the Bolshevik takeover in October in that area, October, November 1917, where no one saw it coming, that conflict. Everyone thought the Kerensky government would continue and, it would just motor on and more democratic reforms. And all of a sudden it happened like that. One of our terms of reference is conflict in the Indo-Pacific region. I'm interested because everyone thinks that it's inevitable, it's inevitable this would happen, or they're a genius afterwards and said, I could really see it coming, or we never had any idea. How can we calibrate our DFAT programs, and you talked a bit about it, Mr. O'Toole, in a way that sort of anticipates that conflict? You talked about data centres, etc. But it just seems like we had a coup in Fiji a few decades ago. No one saw that happening, and then all of a sudden there was, we got troubles in Bougainville that Mr. O'Toole was talking about, PNG issues in the Highlands, etc. How can we actually just look at this and say, right, because this is our backyard, what can we do, and how can we calibrate our programs along that lines to prevent that?
Yeah, it's a great question. It comes to, I think, our recommendations about early warning systems and investing in those. Imogen, do you want to take that?
I can. I mean, I don't think I can provide a comprehensive answer.
But Kieran, you want to jump? Yeah, jump in.
Well, I asked the question because one of the things is about the strategic aspects, and I'm really interested in the bigger picture.
Yep, for sure.
Well, I think just before I pass it to Kieran, it comes back again to sort of multi-year financing. If you have that presence, that consistent presence on the ground where you can track early warning, that's integrated into a program, you can sort of look at sort of those early drivers of instability that might lead to a coup, and then you can sort of rapidly pivot and adapt. So I think this is something that we're strongly advocating for. But Kieran, if you want to add.
Yeah, I think one of the issues, I suppose, in this conflict prevention area is you don't know what would have happened otherwise, and what ingredients were there that could have changed to stop the Bolshevik takeover.
Well, there was no capacity to aid them. The French and the British.
There probably wasn't the sophisticated analysis tools that we have now back then. And that does lead on to sophisticated or analysis, adaptive analysis, understanding what drives conflict, understanding Bainimarama and what drove him to. And that is that depth of understanding that in a lot of ways needs a lot of focus, but also needs that local connection.
Yeah, that's the question.
Because obviously we've worked in Fiji since the mid-90s, and we couldn't have predicted that, but our partners could. The people we work with could, because they know Bainimarama, they know his family, they know, they're immersed in that sort of the societal networks that would provide that information. So it's access to that information is really crucial. But then bringing that up to an analysis. But as I say, you can only go so far. That will generally capture 70 to 80% of potential incidents, but there's always the unknown. and these are, this is a fact. This is the difficulty of conflict prevention.
So that local stuff, I mean, Churchill was bewildered that the Russians would think that, bread and peace would be all that would enhance the Bolsheviks, the support. But, that local knowledge, to what extent are we actually getting our DFAT officials saying, talking to those church leaders, those community leaders and saying, what is going on here? It really seems to me to be where the local knowledge is critical, and we're not missing. We have these big programs. It looks great. We build a sports facility, the gymnasium. You can see it in places like Nauru, etc. It looks great. Let the locals look after it. That's our program. But to what extent are we engaging with people on the ground? That's what I really want to know.
Well, I can maybe come in first. I mean, I think DFAT mentioned in their evidence session also the PNG Church Partnership Program, and I think during COVID that was a good example of sort of, really mobilising quickly through the church networks and getting that information out there. And so they do engage, of course, and through the ANCP, Australian NGOs engage with their long-standing partners on this, but it needs to be resourced.
Well,
I mean, I think
Fiji, we've given examples. We've been talking about examples where we just really didn't see it coming.
I think one of the systemic issues that we have flagged, and again it came up in the OECD DAC report, is the risk of layering a development program. So you actually create structures that implicitly create a barrier from that information, that community level information, or the work with the church groups or the community groups or the women's movements or the youth groups that inform that early warning system or understand the actual context. And again, this gets back to, 28% of the current ODA program is delivered through for-profit commercial contractors as the delivery entities. And about 10%, it's gone down this year, goes through NGOs. And the OECD DAC report mentioned that, that layering creates a barrier because you've got a delivery mechanism that does really well for things like, you've mentioned stadiums or undersea cables or those sorts of things, but doesn't do well at listening to communities and getting those voices amplified up. So I think, again, there's a structural question about the choices being made about how the aid program's the modalities being used. And arguably, and this is one of the things that came out in the report we launched on Monday, arguably you're losing one of your great resources when you create those barriers or that layering in the aid structures.
Thanks, Chair.
Senator Collins.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to start by making a quick comment or reflection before I move into my question, but I just want to say that the characterisation of defence spending, I think, today has been a little unhelpful because it is makes a huge contribution to peace in Australia and in the region, particularly with what we provide to Pacific Island states, for example, patrol boats. And our servicemen and women are all peace-loving people, and that's a huge part of preventing conflict in the region. But in terms of the CSOs and the church partnerships, I think that's such a critical part of what we are doing, particularly in Papua New Guinea and in the Highlands. And look, I've been doing a lot of research into gender equality in the region and the funding that we do, but it still has a very real impact on conflict. In fact, in Papua New Guinea, it goes the other way. That the more educated women are becoming, the higher in status they are going, the more likelihood they are to experience domestic violence in the home. So what can we do as a government, I guess, to start looking at aid and development and conflict prevention in a different way so that we can lift the status of women, but also address those very, very hyper-local drivers and I guess lift men at the same time?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I'm going to ask Michelle to speak on some of those because this is a core area of work, but I just want to start with your initial comment and acknowledging in our representation, this isn't an argument that defence shouldn't be invested in or that doesn't play a key strategic role for Australia and security in the region. I think our message is, and Imogen referenced it, the fact that Australia has a disproportionately high investment in defence spending versus development as compared to other OECD nations is a question for the government to consider. Do we actually think war is cheaper than peace? And I know I'm maybe framing it a little black and white there, But of course, we're living through the implications of Iran right now, and it's a different geopolitical challenge. But we know even I often quoted, I think it's James Mattis, who was the Secretary of Defense for Trump's first administration, and he made his comments known in various places where he said, actually, I would much prefer investment in diplomacy because if we don't spend our money there, it's going to cost us more in bullets. And so the return on investment for peace is, don't cut that at the expense of the other. So it's not an either or, but it's about a balancing and making sure we're investing adequately. On the question of gender and the implications of some of those aspects you've said in PNG. Michelle, are you happy to respond to that?
Yeah, I'm happy to respond. I think one of our observations is this whole focus on women, peace and security tends to be somewhat of an afterthought rather than deeply integrated into Australia's crisis prevention and response efforts. And so really, I think that's where we would like to see a greater focus. And how do we elevate these core principles of preventing gender-based violence, protecting some of the most vulnerable, ensuring women's participation at peace tables and driving more inclusive relief and recovery into all that we're doing in terms of crisis prevention and response. I say that, there are some investments that we are currently making and they are focused on this very notion of how do we elevate women's voices at the table. And what is emerging from those initiatives is that they are increasing, women's voice, women's space and working towards peace, conflict resolution. And just to give you an example, one of those initiatives is the African Women Voices of Peace initiative, which is actually supporting women to resolve conflict and tension at the community level before it escalates, which is achieving those ambitions. DFAT is also supporting the Pacific Women Mediators Network, which is also engaging women, experienced women leaders in high-level dialogue and discussion in the spaces where they need to be, as well as building that next generation of young peace builders. So these are valuable initiatives. They're small-scale investment, and there's definitely a need to see greater sustained investment in, grassroots organisations, women-led organisations on the ground who are driving these initiatives. I would say our experience does show if you invest and give the tools and capability and resource women-led organisations, it does actually lead to greater peace in communities. I think, and I would just also like to go back to my comments about defence, because I it's not to say that there aren't important efforts happening under those areas, but what we see through conflict, including conflicts where Australia has contributed arms to parties, is that it is driving increased conflict-related sexual violence. And Sudan is a classic example of that, where we have seen widespread violence experienced by women. And so we do have to reflect on our role in preventing that. And the best way to prevent it is to try to reduce the supply of arms to warring parties, but also to invest more deeply in protection well in advance of conflict starting. And there's some tremendous initiatives focused on actually supporting local communities and women-led local communities to engage locally with men and women in the community to actually build stronger structures locally and at community level to prevent violence. So I hope that addresses your thing. Effectively what we're saying is there's a great opportunity for Australia to elevate its leadership in this space. We know that women's leadership at the peace table contributes to lasting peace, yet women are grossly underrepresented in peace negotiations and as mediators globally. So we need to continue to scale up and invest in these kind of initiatives and women-led organisations on the ground, providing, as we've said, core flexible funding that can enable them to lead these efforts in communities.
Senator Collins, one other quick response, if you don't mind.
I just want to pick just on military, after, I suppose, a couple of decades of working in this area of conflict, what we find engaging, particular senior level military, is they're very much advocates for this type of work because they work in conflict like I do, slightly different dimension. They understand it the same way I do. It's actually easier for me to talk to military than the general civilian. So I think and this comes back to maybe a whole of government way of thinking, is that conflict is not just lies with people like myself. It lies with military and the attitude of military. And so I think I mentioned security sector reform as regards what is the right sizing of military and security forces in the Pacific, for example, and then also how they act in a sensitive way, in a conflict-sensitive way in their work.
Thank you. We've got 5 minutes. Just want to have everyone on the same page.
Thanks.
Ms Templeman has been waiting very patiently since the start of the hearing, so I'll throw to her, but can you also follow up her question with going to that humanitarian exemption issue raised at the start?
Happy to.
Thank you. Just picking up on the gender discussion that we had a bit of there, you talk in the submission about the current global anti-gender backlash heightening risks for female peacekeepers and those working in programs. Can you just extrapolate a little bit on that, what the reality is and how programs should adapt to that or deal with that or tackle that issue?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And Michelle was particularly going to speak to this, and I do want to come to the humanitarian exemption in those 5 minutes, Michelle, so just on your time. Go ahead.
Yeah, look, I guess what we're seeing globally is that more women than ever, so 676 million, live within 50 kilometres of a conflict. That has been increasing, and we're seeing conflict-related sexual violence in every single conflict that we are trying to respond to. So it is there, and it does require consistent and persistent attention, and as I said, prioritising this at the forefront of our response. And yes, it's absolutely critical that we support and protect women peacekeepers, but also women amongst the civilian population. And that does require pre-investment, and so building a stronger focus on preventing gender-based violence in high-risk contexts, but it also requires investing in response efforts to be able to intervene early and provide access to services and support. So, I mean, what we would say, I think, on all of this is it just requires deeper prioritisation, and it requires scaled-up resourcing to be able to respond to the magnitude of what we're seeing. But it is definitely rising. But I'll throw back to Matthew, because I know our time's limited to talk on the humanitarian exemption.
Yeah, just maybe a comment on that. A year ago, a Joint Standing Committee inquiry made a recommendation, bipartisan recommendation, about the endorsement of creating a humanitarian exemption. We know that our criminal code and our sanctions regime, which are overlapping kind of layers that need to be addressed, are outliers in regard to other peer nations in the world, in the sense that we don't have that humanitarian exemption. And by not having it, it means that Australian NGOs, who, as we've mentioned, have these deep roots into the church faith communities, all these different ways that civil society is important, we're not able to exercise that muscle or that part of our response in countries that are facing conflict. And most of the places that we're talking about where this exemption applies, well, all of them, conflict exists. We know that the Attorney General's office is working on reforming the criminal code. That still needs leadership, that needs bipartisan support and leadership, and we'd like to see it move quickly, because we're faced with a situation now in Iran where actually civil society has a role to play to restore peace and look at a future of democracy in that nation, and the hands are tied. So,
just very briefly on that, can you also just confirm, these laws aren't the only things preventing the kind of harms that these laws are designed to target, are they? You have internal risk management processes within all your organisations.
Exactly. I mean, in fact, that was one of the things from our report, but even the OECD report, is actually that organizations like Australian charities have really sophisticated risk management systems, are accredited, and actually held to a higher standard than any other delivery modality within the Australian aid program. So there's no question that we can work in those complexities. And most of our members have international branches who are working in those contexts and are being used. So as I say, we're tying our hands as Australia by not having that exemption.
Thank you.
Yep.
Members can hear the bells, so I think now is an opportune time to close this hearing. Thank you for your time today. If you've been asked to provide any additional information, including questions on notice, please provide it to the Secretariat by Thursday, 26 April 2026. Please note the responses to questions on notice will be published on the website as submissions to the inquiry. You'll be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence to assist you with answering questions taken on notice today, and you'll have an opportunity to request corrections to transcription errors. I would like to thank committee members and witnesses for their time today, and I declare this meeting closed.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you.
Yeah.